Immigration, Kamal, it's a subject that's been debated in political circles for time in memoriam. Let's hear Margaret Thatcher speaking about it in 1978.
People are really rather afraid that this country might be rather swamped by people with a different culture. And you know, the British character has done so much for democracy, for law, and done so much throughout the world, that if there's any fear that it might be swamped, people are going to react and be rather hostile to those coming in.
That was World in Action from nearly 50 years ago, Camilla. And isn't it interesting how little the debate has changed? Here in the last few weeks is Nigel Farage on the same subject.
Diversity only works, and is a good thing, if it's coupled with integration and basic shared common values. What their diversity has led to, cowardly backed up by the Conservative Party, is now a whole different group of people living within our country. And I put it to you, this is very, very scary. We're going to need somehow, before too long, to make it clear, whilst people are allowed to have their own rights of private religious observance, this is our country. We're not going to have anybody that moves here changing it.
So immigration, how much is too much? There are overstretched public services, record levels of people arriving here to work and study.
Is it necessary for economic growth or dragging on British people's wages?
And there's that little sound of the dog whistle, culture, patriotism, who's allowed to be here and who isn't.
Welcome to a Daily Tea special with me, Camilla Tominey.
And me, Kamal Ahmed.
Well, two people with very different views on immigration join us today for a debate about one of the most important issues for this election. Jonathan Portis is a professor of economics and public policy at the School of Politics and Economics at King's College London and a senior fellow at UK in a Changing Europe.
And Richard Tice is the Reform UK chairman, who is standing for the party in Boston and Skegness. Welcome both.
We're also going to be getting our readers' letters and emails on the subject and sharing some exclusive polling which has been done by Savanta for us. But first of all, to open, let's get an overview from Jonathan and Richard on the issue. And Jonathan, you're going to kick us off.
Obviously, immigration has a whole host of economic, social and political impacts. But from an economic perspective, I think there's reasonably little doubt that overall immigration has been and will continue to be a positive for the UK economy. We know, for example, that immigrants don't take jobs away from British workers. Indeed, over the last 20 or 30 years, mostly we've seen rises in the number of immigrants in the economy parallel rises in the number of British people working at the same time as unemployment has mostly been at relatively low levels, particularly over the last few years, even in times of very high immigration. We know that immigrants make a positive contribution, particularly recent immigrants, to the public finances. So, for example, the Office of Budget Responsibility has told us just in its last report that if there were a significant fall in immigration, this would lead to a significant hole in the UK public finances. In other words, taxes would have to go up or services would have to be cut. That's just the bottom line. In terms of the sort of things immigrants do, of course, immigrants are, like the rest of us, are very varied. There are 10 million people now in the UK who were born abroad doing a whole host of things. But they do particularly tend to contribute to both services like the NHS and social care, of course, but also to some of the UK's more successful sectors. For example, higher education, which I work in, finance and business services, as well as a bunch of other services sectors, in accommodation, food services, and so on. So while it's not all one way, the impacts of immigration, as I said, are very multifarious. Overall, the economic benefits are fairly clear. In terms of public opinion, I will just pick up on one thing about what's happened since Brexit. Actually, over the last 10 years, the British public, despite the political heat, have actually got rather more positive, not negative, about immigration. A majority of us now think that migration is positive, both economically and culturally. And overall, we've become more positive about immigration and its impacts over the last 10 years, not less. So I'll just leave the idea that there is this sort of negative public reaction. That's something politicians may say a lot. It's not really true.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. Richard, I saw you shaking your head gently there. Richard, give us a view which may be somewhat at variance from Jonathan's point.
No, well, actually, the opening observation from Jonathan, I can agree with entirely. Immigration can be a very good thing. The key to immigration is what I call smart immigration, where it works for the individual coming to a host nation, and it works for the host nation itself. The question is about numbers and whether you're talking about a large net immigration into a country, or whether you're talking about almost like a net zero. So if we look back and look at some data, in the 1980s and 1990s, give or take, there was almost zero net immigration, a little bit of positive. And from a GDP perspective, which economists love to focus on, the economy was growing at between 2.5% and 3.5% almost every year, actually, plus or minus. In the last 15 years, we've had large and growing amounts of net immigration, resulting in the last 2 years, contrary to what the population voted for at the last general election, we've now got mass net immigration. In 22, it was 760,000, and in 2023, it was a net number of about 685,000. These are huge numbers that add serious extra pressure at a time when basically there's almost no economic growth. And therefore, if you're dividing the size of the cake by an extra 750,000 a year, guess what? Mathematically, everybody gets poorer. So, and there's been almost no real wage growth in the UK over the last 15 years. It's tiny amounts, whereas real wage growth in the 1990s, over 2.5% per annum over a decade. And that's the thing. Actually, net immigration works when it's well integrated in numbers that work for everybody, and where you get real wage growth for the existing population. What we're seeing at the moment is immigration of a scale where both financially it's making us poorer, but also it's not able to be properly integrated. And so actually, if you end up with large groups of people who, in a sense, don't integrate into a society, a community, don't learn the language, then you get into social and cultural things. So firstly, on the economics, actually mass immigration that we've got at the moment is financially not working for the British people. And culturally and socially, it's having huge pressures. It's adding huge pressures because it wasn't properly planned for. We've got housing rents rising over 20% in the last 2 years, massive pressure on public services like healthcare. And then, of course, and it is, as I say, suppressing British wages. So actually, the truth is, it's reducing the overall quality of life. And so I repeat, smart immigration, as we had in the 80s and 1990s, can be great for a nation. What we've had recently is large and growing scale net immigration that's not working for, it's not working actually for the British economy, and it's not working for British society and for our public services. So you're on a never-ending treadmill where, in a sense, the quality of life is reducing. We can't catch up. And also, crucially, it means there's no need to invest in capital equipment, productivity is collapsing, because basically there's a never-ending supply of cheap, low-skilled overseas labour. We've got to change course. We've got to get businesses in the public sector off the addictive drug of cheap, low-skilled labour from overseas.
OK. Jonathan, I'll be intrigued by your response to that argument. I mean, can we have too much of a good thing when it comes to immigration? The numbers of people coming in have quadrupled between 1997 and 2010. We then had that record all-time high in 2022 that Richard referred to 745,000 people coming in. OK, it was due to humanitarian schemes to accommodate people fleeing Ukraine and indeed Hong Kong. But at the same time, there's a general perception, not least when the Office for Budget Responsibility is now baking in a yearly immigration rate of around 350,000 people, that that's just too high as a number.
So I think we shouldn't get fixated on year-to-year numbers. That number is falling. It's already fallen, and it's falling very sharply now. We can see that in the visa statistics. That's one thing that the government has made a big play of. But on for once, actually, they are actually telling the truth on this. Immigration is now falling very sharply. So yes, there was a big surge after the pandemic because there was no immigration during the pandemic. We opened up, universities opened up, and there were large staff shortages. But I will return to Richard's point. The idea that there is a sort of fixed cake, and therefore you have more people, there's less of it to go around. This is just, and that's a mathematical truth. This is just nonsense. Every economist, whatever their political views, whatever their position on the ideological spectrum, will tell you that there is not some fixed cake. And that, and of course, we can just see that in the statistics. We have far higher numbers of people in work than we did in 1997 or indeed in 2010. And that is, some of those are British people. We have more British people in work, and we also have more people from abroad. Hence, the cake is significantly bigger. The question is, how fast can you grow the cake, and how is that shared among us? And there are some real questions. But the idea that there's a fixed number of jobs or a fixed number of
that's not what I
said. Yeah, that is what you said.
No, Richard, what I said
you
was
actually
Jonathan,
literally said that if you divided the cake.
Okay, Jonathan,
the cake's
let
not
Richard
growing.
come in. Yeah,
Jonathan, it might have escaped your notice, but we're just coming out of a recession. In April, there's no GDP growth. The size of the cake at the moment is not growing, right? You divide that mathematically by a whole load more people, mathematically, we all get poorer. It worked in the 80s and 90s, Jonathan, because we had real growth of 2.5 to 3.5% per year GDP growth. No one's dreaming of that sort of level of growth at the moment.
You're right. Because of the last 15 years, we've seen an exceptionally poor economic performance. Very few economists would attribute to that to immigration. It's a combination of austerity, underinvestment for a variety of reasons, public and private underinvestment, and of course, most recently, Brexit. All of those have been a drag on growth, and there's no real argument about that. But what we have seen in the last few years is there are about 1 million more people in work than there were 2 or 3 years ago. That is all entirely due to immigration. So we do have more people working, more people producing stuff because we have people here from abroad. But I'd just like to pick Richard up on this point about, quote, smart, unquote, immigration. And in particular, okay, so which of the main categories of people would you want to reduce? So the largest number of people coming in at the moment on work visas are people coming to work in the health and care sector. So I actually do tend to agree that the country would be a bit better off in the long term if we paid people in that sector better, we trained more of them, we treated them better, and all the rest of it. But the fact is that A, isn't going to happen overnight, and B, it costs significant amounts of money which need to come from taxes. That's the first point. The second big set of people coming abroad is people coming here to study. Now, of course, students who come here make a very significant net economic contribution, both to the country as a whole and to universities. They cross-subsidize British students because we actually make a loss on every British student we educate. We need to get the money from somewhere. We also make a loss on research. We need to get the money from somewhere. So we could, so there would be less tax revenue, there'd be fewer places for British students, and there'd be less research. Now, I could go through all the categories, but I'm still puzzled to see as to how exactly.
Yes. It's incredibly simple. Look, on long-term averages, about 500,000 people leave the UK every year. So you can welcome 500,000 people every year, and you end up with net zero immigration. What do you want?
I'm afraid that's
I'm sorry, that is absolutely correct. That is
Hold on, Jonathan. I'll come back to you. Richard, carry on just for the moment. Yeah, Richard, and then back to Jonathan.
Within that, you can include the long-term average of international students coming to study of about 200,000. Those students can be welcomed to study here, but then they should not have the right to be able to stay here under a graduate working visa and then a 5-year working visa thereafter. So within that 500,000 coming in, you can have high qualified, highly skilled. I repeat, the 1980s and 1990s, our health system was working a lot better than it is now. We didn't have huge waiting lists. We were training our own nurses and doctors. They didn't have to do degrees as nurses and rack up loads of student debt. We didn't have caps on training places. The role of the government is to train up and skill up and look after the interests of British citizens. That's the fundamental job of government. It's not to welcome unlimited low-skilled immigration that's making all of us get poorer. And I just come back to the simple point that when we didn't have mass immigration that we've now got, the economy was growing faster, there was a greater capital investment program, because here's the key point, which all economists know, since time began, that if you can't afford the labor, then you invest in capital equipment to replace the labor, or you increase the price of the labor. That's how things work. And it's not surprising, as Jonathan has admitted, there's been a low level of capital investment and productivity the last 15 years because there's been no need to. You just get cheap labor from overseas that you don't need to train up, so you don't need to invest in capital equipment. It is literally basic A-level economics that I'm afraid many of these university professors in economics are completely failing to tell the truth on.
Jonathan, you come back on that. But Richard, I also want to ask you, Richard, the reasons for growth in the 80s and 90s are not to do with low levels of immigration. They're to do with huge reforms, supply-side reforms under Margaret Thatcher. They're to do with this was the period before the financial crisis, which completely changed the growth trajectory of most large Western economies, and particularly the UK. What I find difficult, Richard, is why do you lay the blame for these huge arcs in GDP growth or non-growth at the door of one issue, which you say is immigration, when you know, if you know your economics, and you say you do, you know that there are huge numbers of reasons why the economies grew in the 80s and 90s that were then not available after the financial crisis and then austerity, and therefore growth died in that.
I'm sorry.
Why just immigration? Why immigration, Richard?
I'm sorry, Kamal. That is complete nonsense. Where you look at countries around the world that have had high levels of economic growth, the truth is, if you've got a limited supply of labor, you have to invest in capital equipment that makes you more productive. What happened in the 80s and 90s was that as markets were liberalized, then there were much higher levels of capital investment. Labor became more expensive. We didn't have mass immigration. So actually, we became much, much more productive. That's what's happened. And because the cost of labor got more expensive, so therefore, capital was invested. I'm not saying it's the only reason, but it's a significant contributor. And all economists are complaining and worrying about low levels of productivity at the moment, low levels of capital investment. You just need to look at the infinite supply of labor. There's your answer. It is basic economics.
Jonathan, come back in.
There is just a sense of denial amongst the establishment as to the core reason.
Jonathan.
Well, I mean, you have to laugh, really, at Richard trying to explain economics to Kamal and me. But it may have escaped his notice, of course, that while Britain has indeed had the poorest investment performance in the G7 for quite a long time, that is compared indeed to countries which have had, in the case of Canada, much higher levels of immigration than the UK. In the case of Germany, significantly, somewhat higher levels of German immigration
and
in the
Germany,
UK. And in the case of the US,
Germany is in recession.
1 second, Richard. Richard, Jonathan allowed you to speak. Richard, just allow Jonathan to make his points. Thank you.
In the case of the US, of course, famously not a country of immigration at all, according to Richard. So the idea, obviously, that high levels of immigration are what's driving low levels of investment on a cross-country basis. I mean, I think Richard knows that this is nonsense. In a more detailed way, though, the question about the interrelationship between immigration and productivity is a very interesting one, because there are reasons why you might, and Richard, to be fair to Richard, he's not wrong that there are reasons why one might, in theory, expect immigration to reduce productivity. It might reduce the incentive to train, for example. But there are also reasons why immigration might increase productivity because of the nature of the way that diverse teams work together, because you can have people with complementary skills and experiences. It's not about high skill or low skill, but complementary. And there has actually been a fair amount of research that looks at this at a detailed level, both comparing across countries and comparing within sectors within the UK. And what it found, so there were, for example, 3 studies that the government's Migration Advisory commissioned on this, all of which found actually that within the UK, the association that was observed at a sectoral level was actually positive between immigration and productivity. So that's what, now, There's lots of question marks about that. It's probably not true in every sector, but that is actually what the empirical evidence that we have says. And so I think it's slightly odd for Richard to come here and lecture us about what economics A-level or what A-level economics may or may not say.
All right.
Or doesn't in fact say.
Well,
Very briefly, Richard.
Hold on, Richard.
Very briefly, because I want to bring up the
another...
Brexit word in a moment. But very briefly, I mean, Richard, to be fair, Jonathan and indeed Kamal, Richard's done quite well in his life. I think he can add up. He's made millions in property. He's run his own business.
Congratulations, Richard, yes.
And indeed, he's employed a great many people. But Richard?
Yeah, look, there is another point that Jonathan and I probably will agree on. In the economies with low taxation, and he referred to the US, and likewise in Asia, you've had lower levels of taxation. And that's what we had in the 80s and 90s. Taxes were reducing. And that's another key factor to economic growth. And we probably agree on that. What we've had recently is high and ever increasing levels of taxation, partly to fund the extra pressures on public services by the growing population, which has grown in the UK by some 8 million in the last 10 to 15 years. So look, there's a key issue with population growth. That's the key point. I know that you want to talk about other issues, but you just can't get away from the simple fact it's not a coincidence. We've had high population growth, high immigration, and productivity and real wage growth is collapsing in the United Kingdom.
OK, let's just hang on. We're going to leave that there because we've made points on productivity and immigration. I might regret saying this, but let's talk about Brexit. Now, immigration was obviously a key issue for Brexit campaigners and voters. The Vote Leave campaign promised to take back control. But, of course, non-EU migration has driven the numbers coming into a record high since Brexit. We've done some exclusive polling with Savanta, the polling company, and the public were asked if Brexit has helped or hindered the UK's ability to control immigration. The results, as you'd imagine, chaps, are quite interesting. So just a quarter, 24% of UK adults say that Brexit has helped. 71% of Remainers say it's hindered, but Leavers are more divided. 36% say it's helped. 34% say it's hindered. But what we can conclude, I think, from this survey is that there are a great many people in the UK who don't think that Brexit has delivered on its promise of taking back control of our borders. Jonathan?
So I actually disagree on that. I think it is undoubtedly the case that Brexit has given us more control over immigration. Overall, I think Brexit hasn't given us a huge amount of extra economic autonomy for a bunch of reasons. But immigration is the one policy area where it clearly has, and that control has been exercised. The UK used its newfound control over immigration after Brexit to end free movement of workers, and it used it to institute a new system that gave work visas out on the basis of skill and salary thresholds. So we have that control, and we can indeed change that system as we want. And indeed, I did do a little homework in here, and I see that Richard and I had a discussion about this very issue not that long ago, actually, in 2022, when Richard said about the new system, it's a very good thing. It's a very fine thing. It's like slightly Trumpy in there, Richard, I'm afraid. But Richard and I both agreed, actually, when the new system introduced, that this was an example of taking back control, and the new system was broadly a sensible one.
Richard?
And I still agree with Jonathan. That may be something you don't often hear, but Jonathan is right. That technically, legally, we've taken back control over immigration. Where we may differ is that Jonathan might like creating a much more open border system with lower thresholds, lower skill thresholds. My concern is that actually it was then in the government's control, and they have, in my view, allowed far too many work visas, far too many student visas. They set the salary thresholds way too low. We've had a huge expansion, and now the government's panicked because they realise that they've got it completely and utterly wrong. So we've got control. What this government has then done is not use it properly as they promised voters back in 2019 as part of the Brexit dividend. And as I say, I repeat my first observation: smart immigration, net zero immigration, highly skilled, highly qualified, therefore well integrated, can be a fantastic thing, and we should seek that and celebrate it and enhance it. mass, cheap, low-skilled immigration has worked against us all. And that's a matter of great regret.
But Richard, you were in the Leave campaign. Wasn't it grotesquely missold to the public, this idea that if you voted for Brexit, fewer immigrants would come into this country?
Well, that's the blame of that is at Boris Johnson and his government that set the new thresholds. They had the choice. Any new government can change those thresholds. So we still have the ability to control, but this current Tory government, and I'm quite sure the incoming government, 99.9% certain to be a Labour government, will continue to have very similar thresholds, and therefore we will continue to have lots of low-skilled, cheap overseas labour, which will come in, and therefore, Brexit voters who wanted to exercise proper control will feel betrayed and disappointed. And that's the point. You've got the control, it's just how you then exercise it. And voters then have a choice based on who's promising what.
Thanks, Richard. And Camilla, you're absolutely right. I just want to read out a letter here that we get these regularly into the Telegraph. This is from one of our readers, Alistair Bishop, who comes from Northwood in Middlesex. He says, ever since Gordon Brown's bigoted woman comment moment in 2010, many people have voted Conservative, and I think you could put Brexit into that mix as well, Camilla, because the party continued to promise lower immigration. Now we know this was a lie. One more vote that the Tories can count out at the next election, he means. Can we just move on to the issue of public services? Because I think you've both touched on public services from slightly different points of view. Again, just to go back to the polling we did for this special Daily Tea podcast from Savanta, we asked people what they thought when they thought about things like the services that the NHS delivered, housing and the inability to get onto the housing ladder, poor infrastructure, etc. What they put that down to. And the results of the polling that we did, immigration came out top at 19% as one of the main reasons for these problems of public service delivery. That was equal with lack of investment. So, for example, 1 in 5 people think immigration is responsible for GP appointment, the long wait for GP appointment times. Jonathan, can I just bring you in on this issue of public services? More and more people here, but an inability for our public services infrastructure and for our private sector infrastructure, whether that's transport or housing or whatever it might be, to service what Nigel Farage has described as a population explosion.
Immigrants obviously place extra demands on public services. They also pay tax, and you have to look at the balance between the two. And as I said in my opening point, we are pretty clear on what that balance is. The Office of Budget Responsibility looked at what would happen if there were a significant fall in net migration, or indeed a significant rise, because it goes both ways, over the next 5 years compared to its forecast. It worked out what that would do to tax revenues, and then what that would do to the demands on public services. Assuming that the government took the money from the extra tax revenues and put it into public services to meet the new demand. And it found what you would expect, I think, which is that lower immigration results in a significant net loss to the public finances, even after you take account of the savings to public services. And it's not surprising when you think about the logic of this, it's not surprising why. Take the NHS. People who come in here, and remember the people who are coming in at the moment are mostly coming to work. They're paying taxes, they're contributing to the economy. Richard is shaking his head, but I actually have the statistics right here, so I can list them, but you'll just have to take my word for it for the moment. Most of them are coming in, they're working, they're contributing to the economy. Most of them are also typically of working age. And if people of working age typically make far less than average demands on the health service. Most of the NHS money, as everybody knows, goes on people who are retired, especially your people who are over 70 or over 80. So unsurprisingly, the net contribution to the NHS of people who are coming in mostly to work or indeed to study, again, boosting the economy, is positive. So yes, if you reduced the number of people coming in by a lot, as Richard would like, you would indeed reduce pressures on public services, but you'd have more than a proportional reduction in the amount of tax revenue to fund them, and we'd end up in a significantly worse place than we are now. And as I said, the numbers are all set out quite clearly by the Office of Responsibility. And you can go and look at them, you can poke around in them. Richard can shake his head all it likes.
Well, Richard, respond to that, because there may be a perception when it comes to the NHS, Jonathan, that there are a lot of immigrants using the NHS as well as working for the NHS.
Yes, and there are more people using it and paying tax to sustain, more immigrants working in it, but also paying tax to sustain in it than there are using it.
Richard?
The truth is that there is a significant percentage of people coming to the UK who are actually not working. They are dependents, their other half might be working. So there are large numbers that are not working, not paying tax, who are using public services. With the current levels of immigration, we talk about one person is coming legally every minute. We need to build a new home every 2 minutes just to accommodate those who are arriving at the current levels. And that is putting huge strains. And Jonathan's just referred to the OBR. The chair of the OBR, a few months back on Radio 4, admitted that actually, per head, immigration was not contributing to any GDP growth. It was a very significant statement that people in the establishment wanted to bury. And that is simply the fact. We are currently in the longest recession per person at 2 years long and running since records began 70 years ago. And that's how people feel. It's GDP per person as opposed to the overall cake that I know economists are very focused on. There's a key aspect here which we probably perhaps agree on, but we don't talk about enough, which is what's taught in our schools, at primary and secondary schools, in terms of British history, how the nation has evolved over the last 200 years, with immigration being a key part of that. But being proud of that and celebrating it, recognising when we've got things right, recognising where we've got things wrong, but actually sort of learning and celebrating British history and how we've ended up in this extraordinary place, such a small island, but such a major part of the global economic community. And I just think that there needs to be much more focus on British history within the education system so that in a sense embeds it in everybody who grows up here from whatever background. I think it's really important. I fear is being lost.
At the risk of violently agreeing with both what Camilla and Richard said, I think I do agree with that. I mean, I think perhaps where I'm slightly differing with maybe with Richard, but maybe I'm wrong, is that I see the glass here as being half or 3/4 full. I mean, the vast majority of people who come here and live and stay here for any length of time either speak English when they come or learn the language. Yes, there are areas that are more immigrant heavy than others, but residential segregation by ethnicity has been decreasing in this country for the last 20 years and continues to decrease. On the whole, we're actually pretty good at this. And we should, as Richard said, celebrate it.
Thanks so much. Look, Jonathan and Richard, what a great discussion. You're almost in violent agreement at the end, but I'm sure you're not really. And we've got the first part of this podcast to go back to. But Jonathan and Richard, just to finish our conversation, and what a great conversation it is, and thank you so much for your time. Jonathan, just give us a view for the future. Are you positive for the future that this country will come to a more settled idea of immigration, net benefit or net negative, and how do we get ourselves there? And then Richard, I'll come to you with the same question. Just quite briefly, Jonathan, do you feel optimistic that we will get this conversation in the right place, or do you fear that we're going to go down a route where we will have more division and more argument?
I think I'm optimistic about the future of about immigration to this country and its future. I think it will increase. It will be a central part of our economic, social, and political development going forward. And on the whole, we are in a better place than we were 10 years ago, and a lot better place than we were when Mrs. Thatcher made her speech or when Enoch Powell made his speech. On the other hand, we'll never get to some sort of destination where everybody agrees that it's a net benefit by X% or a net cost by Y%. These debates continue to evolve, and these conversations and arguments won't go away. So we're not going to come to some sort of stable equilibrium. It will be complicated and messy, as it always has been.
Richard?
I would be optimistic if we get to a position of really decent economic growth, 2 to 3% a year, where I think broadly that might include, give or take, net zero immigration, sort of one in, one out, then, and those two things may be linked, then I would be optimistic. But I suspect that we've got some time to go before then, and I am deeply concerned at the lack of economic growth, and therefore per person, if people get poorer, how people feel about their communities and just the UK as a whole.
Stop the press. We've managed to have a very chunky debate on immigration without falling out.
It is possible.
Without arguing too much, and actually to have both Richard and Jonathan have moments of agreeable disagreement, but also agreeable agreement, Kamal, I think is progress.
It is, and it's great to have a proper discussion and allow you both to lay out your stalls, to make your points. That's the whole point of the Daily Tea, so we're very appreciative. Richard Tice and Jonathan Portis, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Can I just tell you a little anecdote that might warm your cockles as a Muslim, well, as a man from a Muslim heritage speaking to a Catholic girl? My son has got lots of Muslim friends at school. And if I think back to when I went to school in the 80s and 90s, you know, people were still in the playground saying very inappropriate jokes and using awful terminology about each other. And this is not something that we would have witnessed. Last Ramadan, my son decided to fast in solidarity with his schoolmates. And we sort of questioned the wisdom of this because he does a lot of sport at school. But he said, no, I want to be with my friends. I want to be in the prayer room. I'm not interested in Islam as a religion. I just want to be doing this with my mates. And I discussed it with some of the Muslim boys' mums, you know, headscarf wearing, observant Muslim mums. And we just came to this agreement that there has been a lot of progress made in this country. If that generation Z are not seeing colour, they're not seeing religion, they're just finding commonality between them and their classmates. And I just thought that might warm your cockles.
My cockles are warmed to hot, I would say,
Yeah.
Camilla. I think, I've got children a little bit older than yours, 20 and 24. And it does give you great optimism for the future. They do define the stories quite differently. They don't talk so much about integration or you need to do these things to people who maybe recently come here. They are much more used to just having mixed classrooms of mixed identities, and they just get on with their friends, and they allow much more space for the types of discussion that I think when I was at school, as you say, racism was very closely connected to immigration. I think that has changed a lot over the decades. And yeah, if you look at the next generation, your children, I think your son's a teenager.
Yes.
But, even 10 years older than that, my daughter's 24. Their attitude to this is completely different. And that does give you great hope for the future. What I loved about that conversation, and I think this is the issue sometimes for the media, for us, Camilla.
Yes.
When you have a sensible conversation like that, that is just what the Daily Tea is all about. There are two people who do not agree.
Yeah.
You and I have very different perspectives on the issues around immigration, but you can have a sensible conversation, you can learn a bit more, you can understand a bit more, and from that can come some solutions.